A millionaire pretends to be in a wheelchair during a blind date with a woman. At the meeting, the woman spoke bluntly about the importance of honesty and ignored his appearance. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from, and stay tuned. Blake Allen stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, staring at the glittering skyline that seemed to bow before him. At 32, he was the crown prince of the Allen Empire, a sprawling conglomerate that influenced everything from media networks to pharmaceutical research across America. Forbes had recently valued his personal wealth at just over $4 billion. The New York Times called him the Golden Bachelor. Vogue praised his philanthropy. Times featured him as one of the most influential young leaders shaping tomorrow. And yet, as he swirled the whiskey in his crystal glass, Blake felt nothing but emptiness. "Mr. Allen," his assistant's voice came through the intercom, "the board is requesting confirmation of your appearance at tomorrow's quarterly meeting." And Ms. Harrington called again about the charity gala. "Tell them I'll be there," Blake replied, his voice carrying the practiced confidence that had become his second skin. "And send Claire my regrets. I have other commitments." He didn't. There were no other commitments, just the suffocating realization that Claire Harrington, like everyone else in his orbit, was more interested in the Allen name than the man who carried it. Blake moved to his desk, opening the small drawer he rarely accessed. Inside lay a faded photograph, himself at 22 with Melissa, his college girlfriend. They had been together for nearly 2 years. She was the first woman he'd ever told about his family's abuse, how his father had belittled him for not being tough enough, how his mother had been too lost in her social obligations to notice his loneliness. Melissa had held him as he cried, promised she'd love him regardless of his name or fortune. 2 weeks later, after learning his trust fund wouldn't be accessible until he turned 35, she was gone. Her parting words still echoed, "I can't wait around for a future that might never happen." The betrayal had carved something fundamental out of him. Since then, relationships had become transactional. Women who wanted the status, men who wanted the connections. No one seeking Blake himself, stripped of his wealth and influence. His therapist, Dr. Winters, had pointed this out during their last session. "You've created a self-fulfilling prophecy, Blake. You expect people to want you for your money, so you only allow yourself to be with people who confirm that belief." "That's because it's true," Blake had argued. "Everyone knows who I am." "Do they?" Dr. Winters had challenged. "Or do they know what they've read? What if no one knew who you were? Who would you be then? Who would choose you?" The question had haunted him for weeks. Who would choose Blake Allen if he wasn't Blake Allen? The idea came to him during a board meeting when his cousin James suggested a common touch publicity campaign. "You know, Blake, show people you understand their struggles. Maybe volunteer somewhere, get some photos with regular folks." The cynicism of it had made Blake's stomach turn. Yet a seed was planted. What if he could experience life without the Allen filter? What if he could discover who would value him without knowing his net worth? What if he could find something real in a world he'd written off as hopelessly fake? It took 3 months of meticulous planning. Blake rented a modest apartment in Brooklyn under a false name, Blake Adams. He researched extensively, consulting with medical specialists about how to convincingly appear to have a physical disability without mocking those who truly lived with one. He decided on a wheelchair and partial paralysis, supposedly from a car accident years ago. He practiced until the movements became second nature. He grew a beard, changed his hair color from dark brown to light brown, wore glasses, and dressed in simple, unremarkable clothes. The transformation was startling. Without the bespoke suits and carefully maintained appearance, he became nearly unrecognizable to anyone who only knew him from magazines or television appearances. His inner circle thought he was taking an extended sabbatical to the Allen family estate in Vermont. Only Dr. Winters knew the truth, and while she had expressed serious ethical concerns about his deception, she recognized his need to find authentic connection and agreed to support his journey with regular check-ins. "This isn't about manipulating others," Blake had insisted during their discussion. "It's about finding out if there's anyone who would want me for me." "And what happens when you find that person?" Dr. Winters had asked. "What then, Blake? A relationship built on a lie isn't authentic, no matter your intentions." He hadn't been able to answer. One step at a time, he told himself. First, discover, if such a person even existed. His first weeks as Blake Adams were jarring. The way people looked at him, or rather didn't look at him, was a shock to someone who had been the center of attention his entire life. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others spoke to him with exaggerated slowness, as if his wheelchair somehow affected his cognitive abilities. A few were openly irritated when maneuvering around him in tight spaces. He discovered the city was far less accessible than he'd imagined. The subway was a nightmare. Restaurant hostesses seated him by kitchens and bathrooms. Shopkeepers watched him suspiciously, as if he might steal something. The isolation was crushing, without his name opening doors, without his wealth smoothing. Every interaction, Blake Adams was invisible, or worse, he was an inconvenience. There were moments of kindness, of course. The elderly woman who held doors without making a show of it. The barista who remembered his order and chatted about the weather as if he were any other customer. But these moments only highlighted how rare genuine human connection had become in his life. After 6 weeks, Blake was on the verge of ending the experiment. What had it proven, except that the world was as shallow and self-interested as he'd always believed? He sat in a small coffee shop in Brooklyn Heights, watching people come and go, all trapped in their private bubbles of indifference. "Mind if I take this chair?" a voice asked. Blake looked up to see a woman gesturing to the empty chair across from him. The cafe was crowded, almost every table occupied. "Please," he said, gesturing for her to take it. Instead of moving the chair elsewhere, she sat down. "Do you mind if I join you? Every other table is full and that group looks like they're planning world domination." She nodded toward a cluster of suited executives huddled over laptops. She was strikingly ordinary, in the most extraordinary way. Mid-30s, perhaps, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore no makeup that he could detect, just a natural flush across her cheeks from the autumn chill outside. Her clothes were simple. Jeans, a burgundy sweater, with elbow patches and worn boots. A canvas tote bag overflowed with books beside her. "I'm Emily," she said, extending her hand across the table. "Emily Wilson." "Blake," he replied, shaking her hand. He nearly gave his real surname out of habit, but caught himself. "Blake Adams." "Nice to meet you, Blake Adams." Her smile reached her eyes, warm, brown, and startlingly direct. She didn't stare at his wheelchair or adopt the careful, pitying expression he'd grown accustomed to. She simply looked at him, at his face, his eyes, as if the chair didn't register at all. "What are you reading?" she asked, nodding toward the book beside his coffee. It was To Kill a Mockingbird, a classic he was revisiting as part of his attempt to engage with normal, non-boardroom activities. "Just revisiting an old friend," he said, surprised by his own sentimentality. "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view," she quoted, "until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." Blake felt a strange jolt at the quote, so accidentally relevant to his current experiment that it was almost unnerving. "Atticus Finch," he acknowledged, "wiser than most actual fathers." Emily's smile widened. "I'm a high school English teacher. Getting teenagers to understand that line is half my job description." "Where do you teach?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Westbridge High in the Bronx," she replied without a hint of apology or qualification. There was pride in her voice. "Not the most prestigious address, but the kids are amazing." Blake knew Westbridge by reputation, one of the most underfunded schools in the district, serving a predominantly low-income community. The Allen Foundation had actually declined to include it in their education initiative the previous year. The board had deemed it too challenging for their pilot program. "That must be rewarding," he said, feeling a twinge of guilt he couldn't quite place. Emily laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep and joyful. Rewarding, exhausting, infuriating, inspiring, sometimes all before lunch. But yes, worth every second. She took a sip of her coffee and then asked, "What about you? What do you do?" It was the question he'd been dreading in every interaction. the one that usually led to his hastily constructed backstory about being a freelance financial consultant recovering from an accident. But something about Emily's open expression made the rehearsed lie stick in his throat. "I'm between things right now," he said instead, trying to figure out what's next. He expected the usual awkward pivot, the subtle distancing that occurred when people realized he wasn't someone useful to know. Instead, Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the between is where all the interesting stuff happens. The messy middle is where we figure out who we really are." For the first time in months, perhaps years, Blake felt seen, not as an Alan, not as a wheelchair user, just as a person navigating the complicated business of existence. They talked for nearly 2 hours. About books, about teaching, about New York's transformation over the years. Emily spoke passionately about her students, about how literature offered them windows into worlds beyond their neighborhoods. She never once asked about his family background, his income, or his accident. She didn't probe for details about his past or future plans. When she finally gathered her books to leave, Blake realized he'd been so engaged in their conversation that he'd forgotten to maintain some of his disability performance cues. Panic flashed through him. Had she noticed? Would his entire facade crumble before it had even truly begun? But Emily simply scribbled her number on a coffee shop napkin. "I'm doing a poetry reading with some of my students next weekend at the community center on Berkeley Place. Nothing fancy, just kids sharing their voices. You should come if you're free. We could grab coffee again after." Blake took the napkin, oddly moved by the casual invitation. "I'd like that." As Emily walked away, Blake felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. The simple pleasure of being liked for himself, or at least for the version of himself he was presenting. It was intoxicating. Yet beneath the warmth of that feeling lurked an uncomfortable truth. Emily Wilson might be the most genuine person he'd met in years, and he was lying to her from the very first word. Dr. Winter's warning echoed in his mind. A relationship built on a lie isn't authentic no matter your intentions. Blake stared at the napkin with Emily's number, torn between the hunger for connection and the knowledge that every step forward would only make the eventual truth more devastating. But he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. Instead, he carefully tucked it into his wallet, next to the credit cards that could buy almost anything except what he now realized he wanted most. Something real. The community center on Berkeley Place was nothing like the venues Blake typically frequented. No marble floors or crystal chandeliers, just well-worn wooden flooring and walls decorated with student artwork. Folding chairs had been arranged, in rows facing a small makeshift stage where a microphone stood on a simple stand. Blake arrived early, positioning his wheelchair near the back. His heart raced with an unfamiliar anxiety. This wasn't a high-stakes business negotiation or a press conference, just a poetry reading at a community center. Yet he felt more nervous than he had before addressing shareholders. The room gradually filled with parents, siblings, and community members. Blake watched them greet each other with easy familiarity, sharing jokes and updates on family matters. These were people whose lives intersected naturally, without agenda or calculation. The realization of how foreign this simple human interaction felt to him was sobering. Emily entered from a side door, surrounded by a group of teenagers who clearly adored her. She wore a simple blue dress with a cardigan, her hair loose around her shoulders. She scanned the room, and when her eyes found Blake, her smile widened. She gave a small wave before turning her attention back to her students, offering encouragement to a particularly nervous-looking girl. The reading began with Emily's brief introduction. "Poetry," she said, "is how we remember we're not alone in our feelings. These young poets have found their voices, and tonight they're brave enough to share them with you. Please welcome them with open hearts." One by one, the students approached the microphone. A tall boy with glasses read about his immigrant father's hands. A girl with colorful braids shared verses about finding beauty in her neighborhood, despite its challenges. Another boy, voice barely above a whisper, delivered a powerful piece about feeling invisible. Blake was transfixed. These weren't polished performances meant to impress. They were raw expressions of lives wholly different from his own. The students spoke of struggles he'd never faced and joys he'd never considered. Their honesty was both beautiful and painful to witness. As the final student finished to enthusiastic applause, Emily took the microphone again. "Thank you all for coming. Before we close, I'd like to share something myself." She unfolded a piece of paper. "This is called Truth Tellers." Her poem spoke of classrooms as sacred spaces, where masks could be removed, where authentic selves could emerge without judgment. She described the courage it took to be truthful in a world that rewarded performance, the strength required to remain genuine when falseness often came with greater rewards. "The greatest gift we can offer each other," she concluded, "is the space to be truthfully completely ourselves." The irony wasn't lost on Blake. As applause filled the room, he felt a weight settle in his chest, heavy and insistent. After the reading, as promised, they went for coffee. Emily glowed with pride for her students, recounting behind-the-scenes moments of their preparation for the event. "Darius, the last boy who read, has severe social anxiety," she explained. 2 months ago he wouldn't speak in class, but something about poetry clicked for him. Words on paper became his bridge to the world. "You obviously care deeply about them," Blake observed. "They're worth caring about," Emily said simply. "Every single one of them has a story that matters, a perspective that's valuable. My job is just to help them realize that." "It must be rewarding," Blake said, thinking of his own career built around profit margins and market share. "It's not always easy," Emily admitted. "The system is stacked against schools like Westbridge. We're constantly fighting for basic resources. Last month our arts budget was cut again to fund standardized test preparation." She shook her head. "As if test scores matter more than helping kids discover who they are." Blake thought of the millions allocated in the Allen Foundation's annual education grants, most of which went to prestigious charter schools and elite university partnerships. How different might Westbridge be with even a fraction of those funds? "But enough about my work," Emily said. "Tell me something about you, Blake Adams, something real." The request caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "Well, we've talked about books, my students' New York pizza versus Chicago deep dish," she smiled. "But I still don't know much about you." Blake felt panic rising. His prepared backstory suddenly seemed hollow in the face of Emily's authenticity. "There's not much to tell," he hedged. "I doubt that," Emily said gently. "Everyone has a story." Blake looked down at his coffee. "I grew up with expectations," he said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "My family had very specific ideas about success, about what my life should look like." "And did you meet those expectations?" Emily asked. "On paper, yes." This much was true. "I did everything I was supposed to do. Harvard Business School. The right connections, the right career path." He gestured vaguely to his wheelchair. "Until life interrupted." "The accident," Emily said softly. Blake nodded, guilt twisting inside him. "It changed my perspective on everything." "That makes sense," Emily said. "Crisis has a way of clarifying what matters." "What about you?" Blake asked, eager to shift attention away from his fabricated past. "Did you always want to be a teacher?" Emily laughed. "Actually, no. I was pre-law at Columbia. My parents were thrilled, first in the family to attend an Ivy League school, on track to become a successful lawyer." She made air quotes around successful. "Then I took an elective course in American literature my junior year. The professor was this incredible woman who made Whitman and Dickinson feel like they were speaking directly to us across time." She took a sip of her coffee. "I remember reading Song of Myself and feeling this electric current run through me. I am large. I contain multitudes." That line just broke something open inside me. I realized I'd been on a path that wasn't mine, living up to expectations that felt increasingly hollow. Blake felt a jolt of recognition so strong it was almost physical. "My parents were devastated when I switched majors," Emily continued. "They didn't speak to me for months. They'd sacrificed so much to give me opportunities they never had, and they saw teaching as settling, especially when I chose to work in public schools rather than private academies that would have paid more." "Do they still feel that way?" Blake asked. "They've come around, mostly. Seeing me fulfilled in my work helped, and the first time they attended one of these student readings, Emily smiled at the memory. My dad cried, actual tears. He finally understood that success isn't just about salary or status. It's about impact. Impact. The word resonated with Blake. What had been the actual impact of his life so far? Buildings with the Allen name, investment portfolios, market domination. But had he ever touched an individual life the way Emily touched her students? Had he ever created a space where someone felt safe to be their authentic self? Over the next few weeks, Blake and Emily fell into an easy rhythm. Coffee after her school days, weekend walks in Prospect Park, pizza at a tiny family-owned place Emily swore made the best slice in Brooklyn, movie nights at Emily's modest apartment in Sunset Park, where her ancient cat Oliver regarded Blake with suspicious yellow eyes. Emily's life was so different from his own that it felt like visiting another country. Her apartment was small, but filled with books, plants, and colorful artwork created by former students. She budgeted carefully, clipped coupons, and knew which grocery stores had the best prices for different items. When her car needed repairs, she worried about the expense. When winter approached, she layered sweaters rather than raising the thermostat to save on heating costs. Yet despite these financial constraints, Emily's life possessed a richness Blake's lacked. Her relationships were deep and genuine. Former students stopped by with updates on their lives. Neighbors brought her homemade food and borrowed cups of sugar. She volunteered at a literacy program on Saturdays, helping adults learn to read. Through Emily, Blake began to experience a different New York. Community gardens tucked between buildings, neighborhood potlucks, free concerts in parks. A world that operated on connection rather than transaction. And with each new experience, each deeper conversation, the weight of his deception grew heavier. You seem troubled, Emily observed one evening as they sat on her small balcony, watching. The sun set over the city. Is everything okay? Blake thought about Dr. Winter's warning during their last session. The longer this continues, Blake, the more devastating the truth will be. You're creating a time bomb. I'm fine, he lied. Just thinking. Emily studied him with those perceptive brown eyes. You know, one of the first things I noticed about you was how carefully you listen. You're fully present in a way most people aren't. She reached for his hand. But lately, it feels like part of you is somewhere else. I'm sorry, Blake said, meaning it more than she could know. I've just been wrestling with some things. Anything you want to talk about? She offered. Yes, Blake thought desperately. Everything. I want to tell you that my name isn't Adams, it's Allen. That I'm not paralyzed. That I live in a penthouse, not a Brooklyn apartment. That I could buy this entire building without blinking. That I'm falling in love with you, but everything you know about me is built on lies. Instead, he said, not yet, but thank you. Emily nodded, respecting his boundaries. When you're ready, she said simply, squeezing his hand. Her unquestioning acceptance only deepened his guilt. In his real life, people pressed for information they could use. Emily just offered space to be. Later that night, as Blake returned to his rented apartment, his phone buzzed with a text from his actual assistant. Urgent situation with the Singapore. Acquisition. Board called emergency meeting. Your cousin James suggesting your sabbatical has gone on long enough. Please advise. Reality was intruding. His two worlds were moving closer to collision, and Blake knew he couldn't maintain both indefinitely. Soon he would have to choose. The crisis point arrived sooner than expected. Blake and Emily were having brunch at a popular cafe in Manhattan. Venturing out of Brooklyn for a special occasion, Emily had received a grant for her poetry program. It's not huge, she explained excitedly, but it means we can publish a proper anthology of student work and maybe bring in some visiting writers next semester. Blake was genuinely happy for her, watching her animated description of her plans, when a familiar voice cut through the ambient restaurant noise. Blake Allen, is that you? Blake froze. Standing 3 feet away was Richard Carlson, a prominent financial journalist who had interviewed him multiple times for the Wall Street Journal. My God, it is you, Richard continued, staring at Blake's wheelchair with undisguised shock. What happened? Why are you— I'm sorry, Blake interrupted, his voice strained. You've mistaken me for someone else. My name is Blake Adams. Richard frowned, studying Blake's face. No, I'm certain. The beard and glasses are new, but I've interviewed you at least 4 times. He pulled out his phone. Look, I have photos from the Allen Foundation Gala last year. Emily looked between them, confusion evident on her face. Blake, what's going on? Nothing, Blake insisted, panic rising. This gentleman is confused. Richard wasn't backing down. I'm not confused. You're Blake Allen, CEO of Allen Industries. He turned to Emily. Is this some kind of joke? Emily's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Blake? The moment stretched, taut with unspoken questions. Blake saw the trust in Emily's eyes beginning to waver, felt the carefully constructed world he'd built with her, starting to crumble. We should go, he said finally, unable to meet her gaze. I'll explain everything, but not here. Emily nodded slowly, her face now carefully neutral. The same expression Blake had seen her use with difficult parents at school events. Controlled, professional, the warmth gone. As they left the restaurant, Blake felt Richard Carlson taking photos with his phone. By tomorrow, speculation about Blake Allen's mysterious wheelchair and altered appearance would be spreading through financial news circles. The carefully separated worlds he'd created were about to collide catastrophically, and the only person who truly mattered to him was walking beside him in silence, already slipping away with each step. They sat in a secluded corner of Central Park, as far from curious eyes as Blake could manage. The wheelchair between them now felt like a physical manifestation of his deception, a barrier neither could ignore. I don't understand, Emily said, her voice carefully controlled. That man called you Blake Allen. He said you're a CEO. Blake took a deep breath. The moment he'd both dreaded and known was inevitable had arrived. My name is Blake Allen, he admitted, the words heavy on his tongue. I'm the heir to Allen Industries. Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, waiting. The company owns media networks, pharmaceutical divisions, tech startups, real estate across the country. Blake stopped himself, realizing he was falling into the familiar pattern of defining himself by assets. I'm worth about $4 billion personally. And the wheelchair? Emily asked quietly. The direct question hit him like a physical blow. Blake closed his eyes briefly, then straightened his posture. I'm not paralyzed, I'm not injured at all, it's part of a disguise. Emily stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension, and finally to something that looked horribly like betrayal. A disguise, she repeated flatly. You've been pretending to have a disability. For what purpose exactly? Blake tried to organize his thoughts, to make her understand the complex emotions that had driven him to such an extreme measure. When you're born into extreme wealth, everyone wants something from you, your name, your connections, your money. He gestured helplessly. I was engaged once, years ago, when my fiancé learned my trust fund wouldn't be accessible until I was 35, she left, said she couldn't wait around for a future that might never happen. Emily flinched at this but remained silent. After that, I couldn't trust anyone's motives anymore, Blake continued. Every relationship felt transactional. I started wondering what would happen if no one knew who I was or what I was worth. Would anyone choose me just for me? So you deceive people, Emily said, her voice gaining an edge. You lied about one of the most personal and challenging human experiences possible. You appropriated a disability as a costume. Put so plainly, the selfishness of his actions was undeniable. It wasn't meant to mock or diminish the experiences of people with actual disabilities, Blake tried to explain. It was about removing the wealth filter, seeing who would value me without the Allen name and fortune. By replacing it with a different filter entirely, Emily countered. You didn't present yourself authentically. You created a different, equally false identity. She shook her head in disbelief. Blake, do you have any idea how offensive this is? How manipulative? I know it was wrong, Blake admitted. The longer it went on, the more I realized that, especially after I met you. At the mention of their relationship, Emily's composure finally cracked. Was I some kind of experiment to You? A test case for your will someone like me for me hypothesis? No, Blake insisted. You were the unexpected variable. Meeting you wasn't planned. What happened between us was real. Real? Emily's laugh was bitter. Nothing about this was real, Blake. You lied about your name, your job, your physical condition. You let me believe... She stopped, gathering herself. I shared my life with you, my home, my work, my students. I trusted you. The pain in her voice was unbearable. Blake reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Emily, please. I know I've handled this all wrong, but my feelings for you are genuine. You're the most authentic person I've ever known. Don't, she said sharply. Don't use words like authentic right now. It's insulting. Blake fell silent, recognizing the truth in her rebuke. Emily stood, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold despite the mild spring day. You know what's ironic? If you had just been honest from the beginning, if you'd approached me as Blake Allen, heir to whatever empire, I wouldn't have cared. I've never been impressed by wealth or status. Would you have believed that? Blake asked quietly. Or would you have thought I was just another rich guy with an agenda? We'll never know, will we? Emily replied, because you robbed us both of that choice. You decided what I should know, what I could handle, what version of you I deserved. To meet. That's not connection, Blake, that's control. The word landed like a slap. Control. Wasn't that what he'd been seeking all along? Not authentic connection, but a controlled environment where he could test others without risking his own vulnerability. I'm sorry, he said, knowing how inadequate the words were. I need to go, Emily said, her voice steady, but her eyes bright with unshed tears. Please don't contact me. Emily, no. She cut him off firmly. You don't get to explain any more right now. I need time to process all of this. With that, she turned and walked away, her figure growing smaller against the sprawling green of the park. Blake watched until she disappeared from view, still sitting in the wheelchair that now felt like a monument to his arrogance and fear. That evening, as Blake returned to his actual apartment in Manhattan, the news had already broken. His phone buzzed continuously with notifications. Allen Heir's secret life and billionaire's bizarre disguise dominated the headlines. Richard Carlson's article in the Wall Street Journal was more measured but equally damaging. Blake Allen's wheelchair mystery raises questions about Heir's stability. His actual assistant, Meredith, had left 24 increasingly urgent messages. The final one was simple. Your father is waiting for you at Allen Tower. He says it's non-negotiable. Entering the Allen Industries headquarters without the wheelchair felt both relieving and disorienting. For months, he had navigated the world from a seated position, experiencing the subtle and not-so-subtle ways society treated those with disabilities. Now walking confidently through the marble lobby, nodding at security guards who straightened at his approach, Blake felt the privilege of his actual identity settling back around him like a familiar coat, comfortable but suddenly heavier than he remembered. His father's office occupied the entire top floor of the tower. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan, a physical representation of Howard Allen's philosophy. Always maintain the highest position, overlook everything, reveal nothing. Howard stood with his back to the door, hands clasped. Behind him as he gazed out at the empire, he'd expanded throughout his lifetime. At 68, he remained an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair cut military short, and a posture that suggested he was always prepared for confrontation. So, Howard said without turning, you decided to make a mockery of our family name. That wasn't my intention, Blake replied, steeling himself for the familiar pattern of their interactions. Accusation, defense, dismissal. Howard turned, his steel-gray eyes assessing his son with the same calculating gaze he used on business competitors. Your intention is irrelevant. The result is what matters, and the result is a public relations disaster. He gestured to a tablet on his desk, displaying various news headlines. Pretending to be disabled. What were you thinking? I was thinking I wanted to experience life without the Allen filter, Blake said. To meet people who didn't want something. From me? Howard's laugh was sharp and without humor. And did you find these mythical people who want nothing? These pure souls untainted by ambition or self-interest? Emily's face flashed in Blake's mind, her genuine passion for teaching, her unguarded joy when her students succeeded, her complete lack of interest in status or material wealth. Yes, he said simply. I did. Something flickered in Howard's expression, surprise perhaps, or disbelief, before it hardened again. Well, your little social experiment has jeopardized far more than your personal life. The board is concerned, shareholders are nervous. Your cousin James is already suggesting you lack the stability to lead the company. James has wanted my position since we were children, Blake said dismissively. With good reason, it seems. Howard moved behind his desk, a power position he favored during difficult conversations. You've been absent from your responsibilities for months. You've misrepresented yourself publicly. You've created a scandal that directly impacts our brand integrity. Our brand integrity, Blake repeated, the phrase suddenly striking him as absurd. That's what concerns you? Not that I felt so disconnected from authentic human interaction that I created an elaborate false identity? Your personal existential crisis is your own affair, Howard said coldly, but when it affects Allen Industries, it becomes my concern. Blake felt a familiar emptiness spreading inside him, the same void he'd been trying to fill with his experiment. His father had never seen him, not really. Just the heir, the asset, the continuation of the Allen legacy. The board meeting is tomorrow at 9, Howard continued. You will attend, you will apologize for your extended absence. You will explain that you were conducting deep immersion research on accessibility issues for a new Allen Foundation initiative. You will announce a substantial donation to organizations supporting those with disabilities. PR is already drafting the press release. The calculated cynicism of it all hit Blake with fresh force. This was exactly why he'd needed to escape. This world where every human experience, even suffering, was just another opportunity for brand enhancement. And if I refuse? Blake asked quietly. Howard's expression hardened. Then the board will vote on your future with the company. James has already secured support from several key members. Without my intervention, you will lose control of your birthright. Blake looked around the opulent office with its carefully curated symbols of power and success. For the first time, he saw it clearly for what it was, a gilded cage, as confining in its way as the wheelchair had been, but far more insidious because he'd been raised to want the confinement. Maybe that wouldn't be the worst outcome, he said finally. Howard's eyes narrowed dangerously. You don't mean that. You're upset about this teacher woman. Meredith briefed me, he added, seeing Blake's surprise. Emily Wilson, 36, English teacher at Westbridge High School in the Bronx. Unremarkable background, moderate student loan debt. Rents a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. Hardly worth throwing away your legacy. The casual dismissal of Emily, reducing her to data points and financial status, ignited something in Blake. That unremarkable woman has touched more lives meaningfully in one semester than I have in my entire career. She creates safe spaces for young people to find their voices. She values honesty and authenticity above all else. He stepped closer to his father's desk. And she saw through the facade I've maintained my entire life. The facade you taught me was necessary to succeed. Spare me the romanticism, Howard scoffed. She'll come around once she realizes the advantages of your position. They all do. No, Blake said with certainty. She won't. That's what makes her extraordinary, and that's why I'm in love with her. Howard stared at his son as if seeing him for the first time. Love, he repeated flatly. You're willing to risk everything for a woman you deceived from the moment you met her, a woman who's currently refusing to speak to you. Put that way, it did sound absurd, yet Blake felt more clarity than he had in years. I'm willing to risk everything to become someone worthy of her respect, he corrected, whether or not she ever speaks to me again. Howard shook his head. This is disappointingly predictable, Blake. Your mother went through similar phases, periodic obsessions with authenticity and meaningful connection. It never lasted. Reality always reasserted itself. Blake thought of his mother's carefully maintained social smile, Her increasing reliance on prescribed medications to get through charity galas and board dinners, her disconnection from her own children. Was that the reality Howard spoke of? "I'll attend the board meeting," Blake said finally. "But I won't lie about why I did what I did, and I won't allow our PR team to exploit disability organizations for positive press coverage." Howard's jaw tightened. "Then you're a fool." "Maybe," Blake acknowledged, "but I'm done being a fraud." As he left his father's office, Blake felt simultaneously liberated and terrified. For the first time in his adult life, he was choosing a path that wasn't predetermined by his surname or family expectations. The prospect was exhilarating and profoundly lonely. He thought of Emily's words. "You robbed us both of that choice." He had taken away her agency, her right to decide for herself who Blake Allen was beyond the headlines and balance sheets. He couldn't undo that violation of trust, but perhaps he could stop robbing himself of choices. Perhaps it was time to discover who Blake Allen could be when he stepped away from both false identities, neither the hollow prince of the Allen Empire nor the deceptive Blake Adams in his wheelchair, but someone new altogether, someone real. The realization didn't erase the pain of losing Emily or the uncertainty of his professional future. But as Blake left Allen Tower and stepped into the bustling Manhattan evening, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the tentative, fragile hope that came with authentic possibility. The board meeting was even more contentious than Blake had anticipated. Seated at the head of the long mahogany table, a position that once felt like his birthright, he faced 24 expressionless faces, each calculating how his scandal affected their personal interests. "Before we begin formal proceedings," Blake said, interrupting his father's carefully crafted opening, "I want to address the situation directly." Howard's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "For the past 4 months," Blake continued, "I've been living under a false identity. I pretended to have a physical disability. I represented myself as someone of modest means. I did this not as research or for any corporate purpose, but because I wanted to experience life without the Allen. Name opening doors." Murmurs rippled around the table. James, his cousin, leaned forward with poorly concealed satisfaction. "I recognize that my actions were deceptive and inappropriate," Blake acknowledged, "particularly my choice to feign disability. That was wrong on multiple levels, and I take full responsibility." "We've prepared a statement," the head of PR began. "No," Blake cut her off firmly. "No carefully worded press releases. No strategic donations to disability organizations. That would only compound the cynicism of what I've done." "This is business, Blake," James interjected smoothly. "Personal moral considerations must sometimes take a back seat to shareholder interests." Blake studied his cousin, always the voice of pragmatic compromise, always ready to justify ethical shortcuts in service of the bottom line. For years, Blake had operated under the same principles, convincing himself it was simply the reality of their world. "That thinking is exactly why I felt compelled to escape this environment," Blake replied. "And it's why I can no longer lead Allen Industries in its current form." The room fell silent. Howard Allen stared at his son, his expression unreadable. "I'm not resigning," Blake clarified, seeing the barely concealed triumph in James's eyes. "But I am proposing a restructuring of our corporate priorities and practices. Effective immediately, I want 30% of our annual profits directed to a newly formed community investment division." The CFO nearly choked. 30%? That's over $2 billion annually. "Yes," Blake said simply. "Money that will be invested in underfunded schools, affordable housing developments, and community-owned businesses in the very neighborhoods our real estate division has been gentrifying for decades." "This is absurd," James sputtered. "The shareholders will revolt." "Actually," Blake countered, "I've spent the past week speaking with our major institutional investors. When presented with a comprehensive plan, which includes significant tax benefits and long-term community goodwill that translates to sustainable growth, they were cautiously supportive." This wasn't entirely true. The conversations had been difficult, with several investors threatening to pull out entirely. But Blake had leveraged his personal stakes and his father's shares, which he held proxy voting rights for, to secure enough support to proceed. Blake distributed folders containing his complete proposal. You'll find that this restructuring preserves our core business model while fundamentally changing our relationship with the communities we impact. For it's not charity, it's strategic reinvestment in the social fabric that ultimately supports our success. For the next 3 hours, Blake fielded questions, addressed concerns, and navigated the complex politics of the boardroom. By meeting's end, he had secured provisional approval for a modified version of his plan, 20% of profits rather than 30%, with oversight committees and quarterly performance reviews. It wasn't everything he'd hoped for, but it was a beginning, a genuine one. As the board members filed out, Howard remained seated, studying his son with an expression Blake couldn't quite interpret. "That was unexpected," Howard said finally. "Was it?" Blake asked. "Or was it just the first time I've acted according to my own conscience rather than your expectations?" Howard considered this. "Your mother would be proud," he said, surprising Blake. "She always said you had her heart beneath all my training." The mention of his mother, who had retreated into a carefully maintained emotional distance throughout Blake's childhood, was unexpected. "I thought you considered her sensitivity a weakness." "I did," Howard acknowledged, "until I realized too late that it was her greatest strength." He rose slowly, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "Don't make my mistakes, Blake. I built an empire but lost the things that mattered most." With that unprecedented admission, Howard Allen left the boardroom, leaving Blake to wonder if perhaps he'd never truly known his father either. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Blake established the Allen Community Investment Division, recruiting experts in education, housing, and community development to lead the initiative. He moved out of his penthouse into a more modest, though still luxurious by normal standards, apartment in Brooklyn. He began therapy sessions twice weekly with Dr. Winters, confronting the deep-seated insecurities and trust issues that had driven his deceptive experiment. And he wrote to Emily, not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation, but offering a full accounting of his actions and the changes he was trying to make. He ended the letter with a simple truth. "You taught me that authentic connection requires courage, not the courage to disguise yourself, but the courage to be seen as you truly are, flaws and all. I'm trying to find that courage now." He didn't expect a response, and for 2 months none came. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Blake received an email from Westbridge High School. The subject line read simply, "Student Poetry Initiative." The message from the school principal explained that the English department was seeking funding for an expanded poetry program following the success of their initial pilot. Attached was a formal proposal with a detailed budget and implementation plan. Emily Wilson was listed as the program coordinator. Blake recognized it for what it was, not a personal olive branch, but a professional acknowledgement that his resources could benefit her students. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door left slightly ajar. He approved the funding immediately through the new Community Investment Division with no strings attached and no publicity requirements. Then, after careful consideration, he added a personal note. "The proposal is excellent and aligns perfectly with our new education initiatives. No recognition or naming rights requested. The students' voices deserve to be amplified on their own merits." 3 days later, he received a brief reply from Emily's school email address. "Thank you for the support. The students will put it to good use." It wasn't much, but it was something. Blake threw himself into the work of transforming Allen Industries. Beyond the Community Investment Division, he implemented ethical review processes for all new ventures, raised the minimum wage for all employees to well above market standards, and began divesting from environmentally harmful operations. The financial press alternately hailed him as visionary or derided him as naive. Wall Street analysts predicted disaster. His father watched from a careful distance, neither supporting nor opposing Blake's new direction. Through it all, Blake kept tabs on Westbridge High School, approving additional funding requests as they came through proper channels. He never reached out to Emily directly, respecting the boundaries she had established. 4 months after their separation, Blake was invited to attend an education conference where the Allen Community Investment Division was being recognized for its innovative approach to school funding. As he scanned the program, he noted with a jolt that Emily Wilson was listed as a featured speaker on a panel about arts education in underserved communities. His first instinct was to withdraw from the conference to avoid making her uncomfortable. But that seemed like another form of deception, pretending his absence was coincidental rather than calculated. Instead, he emailed her directly for the first time since their parting. "I see we're both participating in next week's education conference," he wrote. "I wanted you to know that I'm scheduled to attend. If my presence would make you uncomfortable, I'll arrange for someone else from the investment division to represent us. Your students' program deserves recognition regardless of our personal history." Her response came the next day. "No need to change your plans. The conference is about the work, not us. I appreciate the courtesy of your message." The conference was held at Columbia University, where Emily had once studied before changing course to pursue teaching. Blake arrived early for the opening keynote, deliberately choosing a seat toward the back of the auditorium. He spotted Emily near the front, engaged in animated conversation with a group of educators. She looked well, her chestnut hair now cut in a shorter style that framed her face, her posture confident as she gestured to emphasize a point. Seeing her sent a complicated wave of emotions through Blake. Regret for his deception, gratitude for the awakening she had triggered in him, and a persistent, quiet longing for what might have been. They managed to avoid direct interaction until the third day of the conference, when they found themselves alone in a small break room between sessions. The moment stretched awkwardly until Blake finally spoke. "Your panel yesterday was excellent," he said. "The student poetry recordings were powerful." "Thank you," Emily replied, her tone professional but not cold. "Your new investment approach is making a real difference. We've been able to expand our program to 3 additional schools." Blake nodded, feeling the careful distance in her words. This was how it would be now, colleagues with a shared interest in education, nothing more. He had accepted this outcome months ago, yet standing there, seeing her in person, the loss felt freshly acute. "I should get to my next session," Emily said after a moment. "Of course," Blake stepped aside to let her pass. She paused at the doorway, then turned back. "I read about the changes you've made," she said. "Both professionally and personally." "I had a good teacher," Blake replied quietly. A flicker of something crossed Emily's face, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. "People can change," she acknowledged. "I've seen it in my students every day." "But trust once broken is difficult to rebuild," Blake finished for her. "Yes." She met his eyes directly for the first time. "But not impossible." With that she left, leaving Blake with a fragile newborn hope he hardly dared examine. The final evening of the conference featured a reception celebrating the partnership between educational institutions and their corporate sponsors. Blake attended briefly, making the obligatory rounds, then slipped out to the university gardens for some air. He was surprised to find Emily already there, seated on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, a book open on her lap. "Sorry," he said, turning to leave. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not," Emily replied. "It's a public garden." Cautiously, Blake approached. "What are you reading?" Emily held up the book so he could see the cover. To Kill a Mockingbird, the same book he'd been reading when they first met. "Still climbing into other people's skin?" he asked, referencing Atticus Finch's wisdom about understanding others. "Trying to," Emily admitted. "Some people are harder to understand than others." "I imagine I fall into that category," Blake said. Emily closed the book, considering him. "You know what bothered me most about what happened between us?" she asked. "It wasn't the money or status you hid. It was that you didn't trust me with the choice. You decided in advance that I would judge you for your wealth or name." "I was wrong," Blake acknowledged. "I projected my own fears onto you. It wasn't fair." "No, it wasn't," Emily agreed. "But neither was my assumption that your life of privilege meant you couldn't understand real struggle or change in meaningful ways. We both made judgments." Blake felt a weight he'd carried for months begin to lighten. Where does that leave us? I don't know, Emily said honestly. But I've seen the work you're doing with schools like Westbridge. I've talked to people who work with you now. They say you listen, really listen. That matters to me. It's something I learned from you, Blake said. The value of creating spaces where people can be heard. Emily nodded, then gestured to the empty space beside her on the bench. Hesitantly, Blake sat down, careful to maintain a respectful distance. I'm involved with a new initiative, Emily said after a moment. We're creating a community literacy center in the Bronx, combining a public library with art spaces and literacy programs for both children and adults. It sounds wonderful, Blake said sincerely. We're still seeking partners, Emily continued, her tone carefully neutral. Not just funding, but people who can help navigate zoning laws, construction permits, community board approvals, areas where I have limited expertise. Blake understood what she was offering, not a personal reconciliation, but a professional collaboration, a chance to work together toward a shared goal, a beginning of sorts. I might know someone who could help with that, he said, matching her neutral tone. Emily smiled slightly. I thought you might. She stood gathering her belongings. There's a planning meeting next Thursday evening at Westbridge, if you're interested. I am, Blake said simply. Good. Emily adjusted her bag on her shoulder. Just to be clear, this is about the project. It's not... I understand, Blake assured her. No expectations beyond the work itself. Emily nodded, satisfied. One more thing, she added. If you come to the meeting... Yes? Come as yourself, she said firmly. No disguises, no pretenses. Just Blake Allen, whoever that turns out to be. As she walked away, Blake remained on the bench, watching the setting sun cast long shadows across the garden. Emily's words echoed in his mind. Come as yourself. For most of his life he'd been playing roles. The perfect heir, the ruthless businessman, the philanthropic figurehead, even the false Blake Adams. But who was he, stripped of these performances? He was still discovering the answer to that question. But for the first time he wasn't afraid of the journey or its uncertain destination. He was simply grateful for the chance to walk the path authentically, one step at a time. The Literacy Center project progressed slowly but steadily over the following months. Blake attended every Thursday planning meeting, offering practical assistance with permits and regulations without attempting to control the process. Emily led the educational programming aspects, bringing her experience and passion to the developing curriculum. They worked well together professionally, maintaining a careful courtesy that gradually, almost imperceptibly, evolved into something more comfortable. Occasional smiles were exchanged over bureaucratic absurdities. Coffee was shared during later planning sessions. Small moments of connection accumulated like gentle snowfall, not dramatic but gradually transforming the landscape between them. 6 months into the project, they celebrated a major milestone: final approval from the City Planning Commission. The team gathered at a local restaurant in the Bronx, the mood jubilant after months of paperwork battles and community board presentations. As the evening wound down, Blake and Emily found themselves walking together toward the subway. I never thought I'd be this excited about a zoning variance, Emily laughed, the spring night warm around them. The glamorous life of community development, Blake agreed with a smile. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Emily spoke again. You're good at this, you know, working within communities, listening to perspectives that differ from your own. It suits you better than boardrooms. Thank you, Blake said, genuinely touched by the observation. That means a lot coming from you. They reached the subway entrance and paused. In the past, they would have gone their separate ways here, Emily to Brooklyn, Blake to Manhattan. But tonight, something felt different, a subtle shift in the atmosphere between them. Would you like to get coffee? Emily asked suddenly. Not for the project, just coffee. Blake felt his heart rate quicken, but kept his expression calm. I'd like that, he said simply. They found a small cafe still open despite the late hour, tucked between a laundromat and a bodega. Nothing like the upscale establishments Blake had frequented in his previous life, but somehow perfect in its ordinary warmth. Over coffee they talked, really talked, for the first time in nearly a year. Not about the literacy center or educational philosophy, but about themselves. Emily spoke of her parents' gradual acceptance of her career choice, her recent attempts at writing poetry again after years of focusing on her students' work. Blake shared the ongoing challenges of redirecting Allen Industries, his complicated reconciliation with his father, his continuing therapy work. "I've been meaning to ask," Emily said as they finished their coffee, "whatever happened to the wheelchair, your disguise?" "I donated it," Blake replied, "along with substantial funding to several organizations that provide mobility devices to those who can't afford them." It seemed appropriate. Emily nodded approvingly. A concrete acknowledgement of the harm, not just words. "I'm trying to live that way now," Blake said, aligning actions with values even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. As they left the cafe, the night had deepened around them, the city quieter but still humming with life. They walked slowly, neither seemingly in a hurry to end the evening. "This is nice," Emily said after a while. "Just talking. No agenda." "It is," Blake agreed. "I've missed it." "Missed you," he added carefully, testing the boundaries of their newly redefined relationship. Emily didn't pull away, as she might have months earlier. "I've missed certain things too," she admitted. "Your perspective, your questions, the way you really listen." They reached a small neighborhood park, empty at this late hour, but well lit and peaceful. By unspoken agreement, they entered, finding a bench beneath flowering cherry trees. "When we first met," Emily said thoughtfully, "you were hiding behind a false identity because you didn't believe anyone could value the real you. And now?" Blake considered the question seriously. "Now I understand that authenticity isn't about being perfect or completely transparent all at once. It's about being willing to be seen, flaws, mistakes, growth, all of it. It's terrifying sometimes, but it's the only way to form genuine connections." "That sounds like something a certain English teacher might say," Emily observed with a small smile. "I had an excellent teacher," Blake replied, returning her smile. The moment between them softened, possibilities opening like the cherry blossoms. Above them, not yet fully formed but full of promise. "I can't go back to how things were," Emily said quietly. "I need honesty. Complete honesty." "I wouldn't want to go back," Blake assured her. "The person I was then, both versions of me, was living in fear. I'm trying to live differently now." Emily nodded, then slowly, deliberately reached for his hand. "Maybe we could try again," she suggested. "Not as Blake Adams and Emily Wilson, or as Blake Allen and Emily Wilson, but as whoever we're becoming now." Blake gently interlaced his fingers with hers, the simple contact more meaningful than any business deal he'd ever closed or acquisition he'd ever finalized. "I'd like that," he said. "No disguises this time, just us discovering who we actually are together." Above them, the cherry blossoms swayed gently in the spring breeze, releasing petals that drifted down around them like nature's blessing on a beginning that, while imperfect and uncertain, was finally, completely authentic. Dear listeners, we hope you were moved by Blake and Emily's journey toward authenticity and true connection. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it here by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a thumbs up. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life. Don't miss our upcoming content. We look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments.